Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, June 30th, last day of June, wrapping things up on June 2017. Wake up, everybody. Fatso's finally out of bed. The president is tweeting again. But I can't believe that, once again, we have another day of him tweeting. Well, first of all, tweeting, I never watched Morning Joe. It's a bad show. So he's back to obsessing over Morning Joe that he never watches and only live tweets about it. When it happens to come on the air and they mention him, gee whiz, it's so transparent. Anyway, I guess there's lots more Trump news. We'll concentrate on the things that don't really have to do with what he happens to be saying at the moment, although I assume he'll say something incredibly stupid in the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. Everybody's just been waiting around for him to roll on out of bed and get back to tweeting how angry he is at people who get bad facelifts and say bad things about me, etc., etc. Some leaked audio, apparently, from his fundraiser at his Hotel Emolumentum, as they've been calling it. From yesterday, no surprise. Apparently, the leaked audio, according to The Hill, reveals that Trump told donors at the big fundraiser that it would be fun, quote unquote fun, to sue CNN. So this guy needs some new dad jokes, I guess. He's constantly been, and it's not even a dad joke. I've heard that line 100 times as a kid on the playground. I'll sue you. You do that, I'll sue you. My dad's a lawyer. I'll sue you. So I'm still waiting on him to sue all the women who accused him of groping them. Of course, that's never going to happen. This is just his favorite go-to line. Ay, ay, ay. All right, well, there's not much point in concentrating on that when there's much more substantive stuff, I guess, out there. Yesterday marks the, it was the publication of Wall Street Journal's, the Wall Street Journal's article that got, everybody in Washington talking anyway, and I guess this morning I see people complaining that it needs to get much more attention, although it certainly got plenty yesterday afternoon, but that might just be a function of the Washington bubble. The Wall Street Journal's story reporting, what I guess is being held out as the first, how shall we say it? First, it's being played as though it's the first real evidence of any collusion between people at least tangentially related to to be really as fair as possible about it, tangentially related to the Trump campaign and colluding with Russia and Russian hackers. I speak haltingly about it as I'm thinking all the way through, as I'm trying to come up with the words to describe this insanity that is being laid out by the Wall Street Journal. I'm reluctant to say, as many people did, that this is the first evidence of such collusion. I guess it's the most concrete of the various bits and pieces of evidence that have come forward already. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of collusion with Russia. It's just not conclusive evidence, and some of it is merely circumstantial evidence, but it is evidence nonetheless. And it's not definitive proof of things, but that's not what evidence ever is. Evidence, for those of you who are looking for a strict definition, evidence only tends to prove things. It doesn't establish proof by itself. Different pieces of evidence can bring things together to make it impossible to conclude otherwise, but that's not the role of evidence. Evidence, circumstantial evidence, evidence nonetheless. It's just not the strongest stuff. We'll get right to the Wall Street Journal. I prepared for this morning somewhat by anticipating that yesterday's freely available Wall Street Journal article, which was, like I said, freely available at least for the first couple viewings, and I don't know what their algorithm is. Whether once you've read the piece 3 times they put it behind the paywall, or whether just for a certain amount of time they keep it out from behind the paywall, or what. I'm not certain how they work things, but I anticipated that the thing would be hidden from my view by the time I came back to it this morning, and so I put the text aside And we'll pull it out. And where did I put it? That's the next question. Does anybody remember where I put my... yes. Okay, here we go. Shane Harris is the reporter here, and he made the rounds yesterday. As a matter of fact, he stopped by and did a podcast with Benjamin Wittes, who we are constantly reading these days for whatever reason on the Lawfare blog. He works over at the Brookings Institution, and had him in for a short podcast kind of explaining things. I don't think I listened to it, which is a rarity for me. I don't know what it is. I thought it was just I can't listen to my own podcast because I made the podcast. Listening to myself, I mean, I can only imagine. I know that, if I just simply talk for 2 hours, my wife falls asleep. The rest of you are actually interested for whatever reason, but sometimes I intersperse other people's voices, and that helps. If it's your own voice, I don't know if this happens the same way with the rest of you, but for me, it's time to fall asleep. But even then I began learning that even listening to other podcasts, I want to just instantly learn the information like in The Matrix. I can't wait for it to be revealed. Well, some people have patience for these things. Okay. Well, what were we going to do? Oh, yes, we were going to read the Wall Street Journal Clinton email hacking Trump Russia collusion article. I'm hesitant to get started because I see looming before me. I forgot to mention so far that thank Bill in Portland, Maine for starting us off with a morning tweet. But I just have to catch up with it because I want to make sure I haven't missed any instructions on what to do for the show. Daily Kos Radio, obviously, now live. Well, look at this. Issue a special holiday message. May the 4th be with you. Ha ha. It's the wrong 4th for that, of course, but the 4th of July coming up. Yeah, I guess I do need new dad jokes myself. Okay. Well, at any rate, thank you very much, Bill. Look at this, by the way, a comment, early morning comment from Thelonious08. Hey, Armando, are you awake? Are you listening? Have you rolled out of bed yet? Or are you at work? What's going on? Armando, on Tuesday's program, the Kagro in the Morning program, of course, you expressed it exactly. Congratulations. He's paraphrasing now. Sometimes I wake up stunned asking, how did this happen? I guess, well, we're back where we are. We're back where we were and back where we find ourselves so often. Okay, let me just get to this Wall Street Journal piece here. Get it out in the open. You've no doubt read it by now. I don't think anybody could have seen this headline being circulated yesterday and not have read it, but we'll comment on it a little bit as well. GOP operative sought Clinton emails from hackers, implied a connection to Flynn. Very sly of him to only imply it. Peter W. Smith is the operative we're talking about. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Name didn't ring a bell right away, but I did see, was it Jameson Foster from everywhere, Media Matters, etc. But I think we all know him from there, pointing out that Peter W. Smith has a history, of course, as an operative in the Republican Party. He's an older gentleman, or was anyway. Not to spoil the story too much, but that he was apparently sort of a co-conspirator in many ways with Newt Gingrich back in his day. Although I guess I should also point out in the interest of, well, somebody else's full disclosure, because he didn't say it but probably should have, that back in that particular day, they were also teammates with David Brock, who later went on, of course, to start Media Matters, which I think Jameson probably knows and may have disclosed at some later point, or maybe just considers it to have been permanently disclosed. But it's out there. Brock, of course, underwent some sort of conversion and whatever. Okay. Anyway, Peter W. Smith is the GOP operative in question. He portrayed the former general, that would be the spy Michael Flynn, as an ally in an effort independent of the Trump campaign. Sure, just out here doing this on my own, to find personal emails deleted by Hillary Clinton. And I mean, he probably imagined he was doing it on his own in some respect, that he had not gotten a call from Donald Trump saying, go do this. But you'll see what happens. All right. Before the 2016 presidential election, a longtime Republican opposition researcher mounted an independent campaign, that's the best they can say about it right now, to obtain emails he believed were stolen from Hillary Clinton's private server, likely by Russian hackers. In conversations with the members of his circle and with others he tried to recruit to help him, the GOP operative Peter W. Smith implied he was working with retired Lieutenant General Mike Flynn, at the time a senior advisor to then-candidate Donald Trump. He said, "I'm talking to Michael Flynn about this. If you find anything, can you let me know?" said Eric York, a computer security expert from Atlanta who searched hacker forums on Mr. Smith's behalf for people who might have access to the emails. Emails written by Mr. Smith and one of his associates show that his small group considered Mr. Flynn and his consulting company, and it's kind of important to track this, Flynn Intel Group, to be allies in their quest. Flynn Intel Group is the business that Mike Flynn started when he was fired as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency for violating the Pentagon's counter-espionage rules against installing uncontrolled, unmonitored Internet access in the office of the director of Defense Intelligence Agency. His own office, of course, but it was against all protocol and policy for good reason. He didn't want the director's office hackable, for one thing, or an easy conduit from which the director or anyone else with access to the office could simply pipe out large volumes of data undetected by any of the rest of the intelligence community. And he said, "Stupid bureaucratic red tape, I want to be able to pipe out huge volumes of data without being noticed by the rest of the intelligence community, so I'm going to put the internet in here." And they said, "That's horrible, and you're not allowed to do that, and it's insubordination, and we recommend the president fire you," and he did. So then, of course, he started Flynn Intel Group because he had just been fired from one of the highest-ranking intel jobs in the country. Who wouldn't want his intel running your group? Anyway, what role, if any, Mr. Flynn may have played in Mr. Smith's project is unclear. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Smith said he knew Mr. Flynn, but he never stated that Mr. Flynn was involved. I never said he was, I just hinted he was, a lot. Mr. Flynn didn't respond to requests for comment. No surprise there. A Trump campaign official said that Mr. Smith didn't work for the campaign and that if Mr. Flynn coordinated with him in any way, it would have been in his capacity as a private individual. The White House declined to comment. Weak excuse, but there it is. Special counsel Robert Mueller is investigating Russian attempts to sway the U.S. election. You know this already. Whether there was collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign, also. President Trump has denied any collusion and called the investigation a witch hunt. The Russian government has denied it interfered in the election. Mr. Smith died, at age 81 on May 14th, about 10 days after the Journal interviewed him. His account of the email search is believed to be his only public comment on it. I'm just going to say the guy, I understand he died of natural causes and fell into a locked gym bag, and nobody knows how it happened. It's not the same guy, obviously, but this is an interesting development nonetheless. He spilled the beans and died very quickly. No indication whatsoever that he died of anything but from natural causes. 81, that can happen at 71. I wish it would happen to Donald Trump, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so this is also, I guess, the other interesting tidbit you pull out of this is that he spoke to the Wall Street Journal about 10 days before he died, so about May 4th, early May. It is, of course, late June that we are learning of this, and I would like to have known beforehand, but I guess they were trying to check their sources and make sure they were on solid ground in all this time, and I guess you got to do that. Otherwise, they just call it fake news. Oh, by the way, if you do all that groundwork, they will call it fake news anyway, but at least you'll be able to prove that they're not right about you. The operation Mr. Smith described is consistent with information that has been examined by U.S. investigators probing Russian interference in the elections. See? Those investigators have examined reports from intelligence agencies that describe Russian hackers discussing how to obtain emails from Mrs. Clinton's server and then transmit them to Mr. Flynn via an intermediary, according to U.S. officials with knowledge of the intelligence. It isn't clear who that intermediary might have been or whether Mr. Smith's operation was the one allegedly under discussion by Russian hackers. The reports were compiled during the same period when Mr. Smith's group was operating, according to the officials. So they're being extremely careful here at the Wall Street Journal, even as they drop this headline, right? What they're saying is that Smith admits to having had an intermediary of his own, Eric York, poke around in hacker forums asking either, has anybody got these emails or can you get these emails? And if you can, could you give them to me? I'm talking to Mike Flynn about this stuff, and I can pass it on to him, and you may recognize Mike Flynn's name as being prominent in the Trump campaign. So in other words, if you can get a hold of those emails, I can get them to Donald Trump and his campaign if you'll just provide them to me. Meanwhile, at the same time, independently, what they're saying here is that intelligence sources say that they have indications that at the same time that Smith was doing this, there's evidence that they have conversations among Russian hackers talking to one another about getting a hold of those Clinton emails one way or another and getting them delivered to Flynn, and that they are aware of an intermediary who can help pass these emails on if they get them, and so that they will land on Flynn's lap. And you want them on Flynn's lap because he's obviously connected to Trump. What they're saying here in the Wall Street Journal is it could be that yet another person, entirely as yet unnamed, not Flynn, not Smith, not York, is also at the same time asking Russian hackers to find these things, and they'll give those emails to Flynn. It's not obviously and indisputably on the record here that in the intelligence record that this seeking out of Russian hackers to find these Clinton emails is Smith's operation. There could be more than one. That's all they're saying here. The likelihood of there being a different one and that this is not Peter Smith's operation, it seems probably pretty small. It seems like the sort of thing, particularly if it's actually happening, as they try to allege here, independent of the campaign. How many people independently of the campaign are going to be out there financing these hacking expeditions with the purpose of not only getting them to the Trump campaign, but getting them to the Trump campaign via Mike Flynn? That doesn't necessarily seem like the most obvious backdoor into the campaign. I mean, why not Paul Manafort? Why not Roger Stone? Why not Steve Bannon? Why not why not Ivanka Trump? There's a million different ways that they could get those emails to Trump. The interesting thing is that, quote unquote, both, if there are more than one, both of the operation of which the intelligence community has evidence of Russian hackers discussing, and the one to which Peter Smith admits, both operations include moving the emails through Mike Flynn, who wasn't exactly a household name at that point. So I would say it's a pretty good odds that we're talking about the same thing. That's clearly what the writer thinks too. So where were we with this? Mr. Smith said he was working independently and wasn't part of the Trump campaign, and that could actually be true. His project began over Labor Day weekend 2016. When Mr. Smith, a private equity executive from Chicago, active in Republican politics, said he assembled a group of technology experts, lawyers, and a Russian-speaking investigator based in Europe to acquire emails the group theorized might have been stolen from the private server Mrs. Clinton used as Secretary of State. To be clear here, and here I'm borrowing from the writer's own, Shane Harris, again, is the writer here for the Wall Street Journal. Shane Harris's own explanation to Benjamin Wittes on the Lawfare podcast that I listened to. I'll carry that over and sort of paraphrase what he was saying. It seems that Smith, either on his own or at someone else's urging, becomes convinced that the missing emails if you remember the story, of course. And here we're talking about the roughly 30,000 or so emails that didn't get turned over by Hillary Clinton to the State Department or any of the investigators looking into, well, her use of a private server, which they are looking into as a branch out from their investigation of Benghazi that went nowhere. And, of course, there's some number of these emails that were alleged by Clinton and her team to be entirely personal in nature and therefore not relevant to the investigation and within her prerogative to withhold because they were entirely private. And that raised a lot of questions. And if you're suspicious of Hillary Clinton, you're obviously going to suspect that maybe some of those emails actually had, remember they're on a hunt for emails indicative of her issuing the stand down order or some other stupid thing like in Benghazi or any other dirt that they can possibly find, of course, is what they're looking for. They don't even really know. They're just looking for whatever might be incriminating in some way, whether about Benghazi or anything else. They're unable to come up with any of it, apparently, and they suspect, these partisan researchers do, that among the 30,000 deleted personal emails is the evidence they're looking for. So they got to find those emails. So Smith theorizes, with no proof and none offered at any point, according to Harris, that hackers, Russian hackers in particular, he theorizes, most likely to be the ones who've done it. He theorizes that her personal email server has in fact been hacked, that her security's been breached, this despite the announced conclusion, well, it was a little iffy, from James Comey, that the FBI in their investigation said there's no evidence that her system had ever been breached, no evidence that she'd ever been successfully hacked. But he also did hedge it that said, I'm not entirely sure that we have proof that she never was. We just don't have any proof that we know of that it did happen. It's one of those difficult to impossible to prove a negative situations. But Smith's theory, probably shared by a lot of conspiracy theorists, was that she had in fact been hacked, and those emails were among basically that hackers had stolen all her emails, and that they would have the entire thing, including the 33,000 emails that she deleted because they were personal or otherwise withheld from investigators. And if the hackers would just turn them over to him, he could vet them and then determine their authenticity and then hand them over to Flynn, and Flynn would carry them to the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign would exploit them from there on. Now, I guess, it didn't matter to him that he didn't have any proof of it. It was just a hunch that he had, and he's a financier and rich dude and an opposition researcher with lots of Republican connections. He decided in his dying months, I don't know if he knew that was the case, that he was going to spend his time searching hacker forums, or paying someone else who knew what they were doing to search hacker forums to try to come up with these emails. In other words, when Trump stood up and said, Russia, if you're listening, I'd sure love to get my hands on those 33, maybe you can find those 33,000 emails. Peter Smith said, you know what? I think I can find the Russians who can get those things. And I've got money to burn. Let me try to put this project together. So beginning Labor Day weekend in 2016, that's exactly what he does. He hires a bunch of hacker-connected people and lawyers and Russian-speaking investigators and starts looking for these things. Smith's focus, as we said, is some 33,000 emails Mrs. Clinton said were deleted because they were deemed personal. Mr. Smith said he believed that the emails might have been obtained by hackers and that they actually concerned official matters Mrs. Clinton wanted to conceal, two notions for which he offered no evidence. That's actually right in the write-up here. Mrs. Clinton gave the State Department tens of thousands of emails related to official business. So it's not entirely clear from this whether he believed that even if no hackers had ever breached the system, whether it was possible somehow to hire hackers who could breach the system now and find those emails somehow or restore them somehow. I don't know what he thought was possible technically. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody who knows what they're talking about. But what he's copping to here anyway is that he believed they were already stolen, and that makes much more sense to me in terms of like the obtainability of them. If they were already stolen and that someone was just sitting on them waiting to figure out exactly what use to make of them, and he would, he'd like to discover that cache somewhere and bring it to light. I mean, I guess it's possible. Like if you're talking about Russian hackers breaching her private server and just grabbing all her emails and not being particularly skilled in English, perhaps, they didn't really know what they had, and they were just sitting on it waiting for the opportunity to, either partner with or hire somebody to help them parse out what's the good stuff that's saleable. And then this guy comes along and says, I'll buy the whole lot. Anyway, former Federal Bureau of Investigator Director James Comey said in July 2016 there was no evidence the private server, that's Clinton's private server, had been hacked, but he held out the possibility it could have been. In the interview with the Journal, Mr. Smith said he and his colleagues found 5 groups of hackers who claimed to possess Mrs. Clinton's deleted emails, including 2 groups he determined were Russians. We knew the people who had these were probably around the Russian government, Smith said, which is actually not getting enough attention in that sense. There's the part of the story is not getting enough attention that even Smith, who's on Trump's side, knows that the likelihood of them being just, like for instance, just freelance amateur hackers as opposed to being directed by the Russian government is pretty low. So that's pretty remarkable right there. If the emails are in fact out there and some hacker groups have got them, it's probably these groups actually at least tangentially attached to the Russian government. It's very difficult and it's kind of a gray area. And when you're running a kleptocratic thugocracy, it's the lines are intentionally blurred. I mean, how much time have we spent reading about somehow motorcycle gangs involved in invading Ukraine? I mean, if you can have that in your storyline, then you can certainly have hacker groups attached to the government. And I don't think anybody even disputes that. Anyway, he thinks that at least 2 of the groups he's speaking to who claim to have the emails, and they could all be lying, and I think he was aware of that possibility, and it certainly wouldn't be beyond a hacker group to simply respond to a request like this and say, sure, if you anonymously pay us in Bitcoin, we'll give you the emails. We totally have them. And you just try and basically find a way to get money delivered to you without actually having to give anything up. Maybe you deliver some bogus product, or maybe you just do nothing and say, come and get us. We're hackers living in Russia. And we split our money with the Russian government for protection, so you're never going to get us, right? Could obviously be that. And Smith is aware of that, and he's looking to vet these, whatever it is he turns up. Anyway, so he thinks that the people who have them, and we don't know that anybody has them, but he believes they have them, and he believes those people that say they have them are in and around the Russian government. U.S. intelligence agencies have accused the Russians of stealing emails from the Democratic National Committee and Mrs. Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. We know about that. And providing them to WikiLeaks last summer as part of a multifaceted operation to interfere with the election and help Mr. Trump's campaign. Mr. Trump, on July 27th, publicly encouraged Russia to go further and find the Clinton emails that are missing. Asked about that on Monday, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said Mr. Trump was joking, as he was with everything that gets him in trouble. Mr. Smith said after vetting batches of emails offered to him by hacker groups last fall, he couldn't be sure enough of their authenticity to leak them himself. We told all the groups to give them to WikiLeaks, he said, which is also kind of an extraordinary admission. WikiLeaks has never published those emails or claimed to have them, interestingly enough. But there you have it. So, all the I love WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks is fantastic, and all the mentions of WikiLeaks by Trump himself, and this guy who's doing an independent effort to try and find the very thing that Trump himself on July 27th insisted that Russians get to work on, and he just independently decided to talk to Russian hackers about getting to work on it. And if he got them, send them to him so he can give them to Flynn. And then he decides, okay, the product he gets, he's not sure about. So I'm not sure whether they're real or not. Give them the WikiLeaks. They don't give a good goddamn whether they're right or not. They'll leak them just the same. And then I guess apparently they were either so crappy or whatever that WikiLeaks has never leaked them and denies even having them. Interesting. They must be fascinating. They're probably about polenta. Mr. Smith said, by the way, for all of you Pizzagate enthusiasts who are not listening to the show and who will never run into anybody who is listening to the show because we would avoid you like the plague, I guess ponder that for a while. Russian hackers say they broke into her server, stole all her emails, including the deleted ones, and gave them to WikiLeaks. And you've heard absolutely squat about any of your stupid theories, up to and including Pizzagate. Just pointing that out. Mr. Smith and one of his associates, back to the article, said they had a line of communications with Mr. Flynn and his consulting company. What was that line of communication? One might wonder. Well, in one Smith review, it says one Smith reviewed. I imagine one Smith statement or email reviewed by the Journal, intended to entice outside experts to join his work. He offered to make introductions to Mr. Flynn's idiot son. I added the idiot. Mr. Flynn's idiot son, Michael G. Flynn, who worked as chief of staff, amazingly enough, in his father's company. Again, the company that Flynn, the spy, founded when he was fired for violating counter-espionage rules in the Pentagon. He handed over the chief of staff work at that company to his idiot son, who I guess couldn't get any work otherwise, and who spends most of his time on Twitter propagating Pizzagate theories. No wonder he was so interested in getting these emails. Mr. Smith's email mentioned the son, Michael G. Flynn, among a small number of other people he said were helping. Michael G. Flynn also didn't respond to requests for comments, even though he's commenting all over Twitter all the time. In another recruiting email seen by the Journal, Jonathan Safran, a law student Mr. Smith described as a close colleague. I guess he's a mentor to everybody. 81-year-old guy, apparently, unbeknownst to him, about to die. Close colleagues with law students. Maybe the guy decided to go back to law school at 68 years of age. God bless him. Jonathan Safran, a law student Mr. Smith described as a close colleague, included links to websites and LinkedIn profiles of people purportedly working with the Smith team. At the top of the list was the name and website of Flynn Intel, which Mr. Flynn set up after his 2014 firing as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Mr. Safran declined to comment on his email or Smith's project. In phone conversations, Mr. Smith told a computer expert he was in direct contact with Mr. Flynn and his son, according to this expert. The person said an anti-Clinton research document prepared by Mr. Smith's group identified the younger Mr. Flynn as someone associated with the effort. The expert said that based on his conversations with Mr. Smith, he understood the elder Mr. Flynn to be coordinating with Mr. Smith's group in his capacity as a Trump campaign advisor. This, of course, exactly what the Trump White House denies. Oh, no. He was an independent guy. We didn't have anything to do with him. He just had the number of our chief national security advisor and was telling Russian hackers on Russian hacking forums that if they would please hack those emails, he'd get them to Mr. Flynn in his capacity as a private individual. Okay. The senior Mr. Flynn was fired, of course, as national security advisor in February after misleading administration officials about his conversations with the Russian, curiously enough, ambassador concerning sanctions. These conversations put Mr. Flynn under scrutiny by the FBI and then the special counsel, according to U.S. officials. Mr. Smith said in the interview he supported Mr. Flynn's efforts during the presidential transition to establish relations with Russian officials. They were already established, though. Mr. Smith said he didn't intend to pay for any emails found by hackers. Oh, of course not. They were just going to give them to him for free. And if they were, and it's entirely possible, that would, of course, raise the question of, why were they doing this? Maybe they were doing it because they were doing it at the direction of the Russian government, who would then be able to pay them. Or maybe just independent Russian oligarchs would reward them because they were so happy to see Trump elected. I'm sure there's some compensation structure somewhere. Economic theory tells us so. Anyway, he said, Smith did, that he understood the risk in publishing the emails himself. If under public scrutiny they proved not to be genuine, people would say we made them up, he said, and the whole project would be dismissed as a Republican hit job on the Clinton campaign, which is, of course, what it is. In the early 1990s, Mr. Smith helped publicize Arkansas state troopers' claims that then-Governor Bill Clinton had enlisted them to arrange trysts with women, an unproven allegation denied by the Clinton White House. So he's been around that long, as by way of background. Mr. Smith's views on Russian hacking were complex. How so? While he said he believed Russians were likely among those who tried to steal Mrs. Clinton's emails, he dismissed intelligence agencies' conclusions that Russia's government meddled in the election to discredit Mrs. Clinton and help Mr. Trump. He just happened to think that the only two groups most likely to have the emails he was looking for were hacking groups affiliated with the Russian government, but they weren't really doing anything, you see, because they're lazy, I guess. Mr. Smith was himself once a hacking victim, the final paragraph notes. Emails he wrote about a 2015 contest to fill former House Speaker John Boehner's seat were stolen from the Illinois Republican Party and then made public in a campaign U.S. intelligence officials attributed to Russian actors. I had forgotten all about this. Had you? Mr. Smith didn't dispute that Russia might have been to blame. He said, though, he was unconcerned about his messages being exposed. And that's actually how the article ends. Rather curious place to stop and all of that. But, gee whiz, there's an awful lot of Russia involved in this guy's day-to-day routine. And everyone he believes might be credible enough to actually have the emails he was looking for was Russian. He just, I like the way of putting it, his views on the hacking are complex. I believe the Russians sponsor hacking groups with government money, and that they are official arms of what passes as the Russian government. I believe they hacked Hillary Clinton's server. I believe they're in possession of the emails. I believe that I can obtain those emails and give them to Michael Flynn for the Trump campaign to use. And I believe this because I have myself been a victim of Russian government-sponsored political hacking. And then you say, all very interesting, because that's what the investigators working with Robert Mueller now and the FBI earlier have come to believe as well. So you're endorsing their theory of the crime as well? No, I don't. I don't believe that they have any evidence of anything. Well, but they have the evidence. What they have is evidence of exactly the things that you claim to have believed enough to have invested your time and money in pursuing. Isn't that odd? No, it's not odd. It's totally something different. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't believe that. I don't think the intelligence agencies have it right. No, they're completely wrong about what they think the Russians are doing, even though it's the same thing I think the Russians are doing. But when I think it's right, when they think it's wrong, that's basically it. Gimme-tarianism rears its ugly head in the whole thing once again. Okay, so let's see. During the reading of this piece, I did get a note. Armando was wondering, what's up? I heard you mention my name, and I was just passing on the note that Thelonious08 thought you had phrased things well on Tuesday. But certainly if you have something to add to the scene, you're certainly welcome to join us. It's a Friday, and closing out the show, always a bit of a challenge, but I'm sure we can make it easier with a little bit of discussion. No pressure, though. We certainly have plenty of things to get through, and really I should just be zipping through Pocket here and pulling out some of the longer reads that we have put aside for other days, and use Friday for that, and no problem. If you want to comment along on some of those articles, that's certainly welcome as well. All right. Oh, he's anxious to go. Yeah, good morning, Armando. How you doing?
Yeah, what piece of brilliance on Tuesday does he
the whole thing.
complimenting?
It's anything you said on Tuesday.
I agree, but
Monday you were an idiot, but Tuesday you were smart. Let's see. He was paraphrasing here. I guess your comment that sometimes I wake up stunned, asking how did this happen?
Oh well, yes, but I assume everybody sort of wakes up that way.
Yeah, I mean that may not be. It's dead on, but I guess in
fairly obvious.
Hindsight, yeah, it might not be brilliant.
No,
it's correct, but yeah,
no.
right.
I'm not Joe Scarborough who just woke up today and realized that maybe Trump isn't such a nice guy.
Yeah, the president is unwell. They're back on that this morning, obviously. I had to kind of cut off and get started on the show, but I just, I did manage to catch that Trump got out of bed and turned on Morning Joe and said, I never watched this show, which sucks right now, which I'm telling you.
But I did watch it today, and he's a liar.
Right. And he has a long record as a liar because of all the other ones I didn't watch. Yeah, he's live tweeted Morning Joe since forever. And
I thought the interesting thing that happened this morning was basically this Trump admitting that he runs the National Enquirer.
Yes. That's kind of that's come up in the past. He's got some kind of weird relationship with the Enquirer. Not hard to believe given his John Barron background. He loves gossip rags. And,
he's really tight with Harvey Levin of TMZ.
Right, we were talking about that yesterday. We were reading the Think Progress piece about how suddenly TMZ has become this weird, it ends up being a propaganda arm for Trump. But basically that Levin is a big Trump fan because they talk to one another. And he's just developing the same relationship Trump is, that he maintained with New York's gossip columnists in the 80s and 90s. TMZ is just the biggest gossip column going now, so he decided to call them up. And, TMZ, it's not that hard to get into good graces of TMZ if you're any level, a C-level celebrity. I mean, if you've watched their TV show, and I actually have, and it's actually somewhat entertaining, but the running joke in the house as we watch it, winding down to go to bed at the end of the day is who are they interviewing? Because all, celebrity watchers know exactly who they're talking to. And, that's the person from thus and such a show or movie. And invariably, they were in Fast and Furious 4. I didn't see that.
That happens to me on every show.
Yeah.
Who is that?
Right. But they know everybody, okay. So they're going to be thrilled to death to talk to somebody from The Apprentice who, I never watched The Apprentice, but I absolutely knew that it was on the air. I didn't realize when it was canceled, but and I certainly knew who Donald Trump was from well before that. So, of course, Harvey Levin's going to be thrilled to death to have that kind of celebrity call him and confide in him. If he also happens to be the president of the United States, well, so much the better from Harvey Levin's point of view. So TMZ, is sort of stealthily becoming a player in all this. National Enquirer, I guess, always has been the king of the gossip rags and fake news, by the way. Although they seem to win their lawsuits pretty often. So that's kind of an amazing thing. So he was able to, he was blackmailing Mika and Joe. I will tell some sordid tale about you that you would prefer stay hidden to the National Enquirer, and I can make or break their decision to run or spike the story. And
you could read his tweet, but it said that Joe Scarborough called him and asked him to intercede with the National Enquirer and spike this story. Yeah. And according to Trump told him, no, I'm not going to do that.
Which is why we all know the story. What is this? Which is why we all know the story. Trump says, no, I'm not going to stop the National Enquirer from telling this blockbuster story. So what's the story?
I actually don't know what the story is, to be honest with you.
Me neither.
So I have no idea what it's about.
Yeah, because there's no story.
I'll be honest with you. I mean, the National Enquirer is just crazy. So who even pays attention to?
I don't know.
Listen, I mean, that's what happened with that John Edwards story, which they ran, and we just said, oh, well, it's, John Edwards had a Martian baby type story. But, of course, it turned out to be true.
Yeah. I mean, the Enquirer isn't the Weekly World News. That's That's true. I mean, I don't know.
Close, though, isn't it? I mean, I can only look back at a couple, once in a while I'm in a drugstore or something and I see this crazy national inquiry thing. What I saw was Trump is going to, Hillary begging Trump not to indict her and things like that.
Right.
And Obama, God knows what. I can't even remember now. But it was, some crazy nonsense.
Yes. I bring up the Weekly World News. They're the ones with, I think, Bat Boy. I've seen that one.
They're the ones that always have aliens in them,
yes.
right?
That's it's the Weekly World News usually is the one with the pictures of monsters that are invading America or
right.
born.
Well, InfoWars had a story about something I forget, but something gets shipped to Mars.
Oh yeah, sure.
I mean, I don't know the whole outlines of it, but Mars is involved.
Yeah.
Somehow. Alex Jones.
Yeah.
Trump has a lot of respect for Alex Jones.
Apparently he does, and he's been on his show, but then he's been on Howard Stern too, and so I don't know. He goes on any show that'll have him, I guess, and then if they won't have him, he tweets that they're begging him to come
on Fox now, though.
Oh yeah. But that's a fairly frequent thing for Trump to do. A standard MO for him is, particularly if he wants to be on a show and they won't have him, or he's interested in making some show look bad for whatever reason. They've said something bad about him. He just announces that they've been begging him to go on the show, but no, I wouldn't go because they're too low rated. And then of course they come out and say, we never invited Donald Trump on the show. There's no reason to have Trump. Think about it,
Well, I mean, he's the president now, but before then there was no reason to have him on for, that's why he has fake time covers running around. Right. Look, I mean, the thing about today is if you've been a watcher, and I have because I've spent a lot of time in New York for the last 30 years or 25 years, and Trump has been this guy. Well, he became much more racist later, I must say. He was just,
it might
crazy
be a function of
narcissist,
age. That happens.
Liar.
Yeah.
But, he incarnated into the birther and whatever the heck he is now. I'd say, 7-8 years ago?
Yeah.
But he's always been this horrible person.
Yes.
And anybody, look, it's now defunct and you kids out there won't recognize it, but Spy Magazine was the best at covering Trump. Never been matched. Of course, Graydon Carter now runs Vanity Fair, but he doesn't do the same things they used to do back at Spy. It was the funniest thing. The greatest story, of course, is they sent him a check for 7 cents and he cashed it.
Yeah. Well, they were very good. They had leeway that Vanity Fair does, and Vanity Fair is, I don't know what they describe themselves as, but they take themselves seriously. Spy was a humor magazine.
Yeah, a humor magazine, but it really got to it. Yeah, it described Trump like no other publication ever has.
Yeah, which is why and that should come as no surprise to anybody who's been over the past decade fans of Jon Stewart or any of the other spin-off shows of the Daily Show or the original Daily Show and the creation of the Daily Show by Liz Winstead. Everybody knows that the comedians, if they're good, they make the exposing the truth that should be being discussed on the news funny and entertaining. But the button-down news, they have to be. They have to maintain their dignity and they have to worry about being sued all the time. And comedians, I guess, consider themselves to have more license and leeway. And if you're on cable television, the ability to, use vulgarity to punch it up and make it that much funnier. So no surprise that Spy Magazine would have done a better job than the rest of the media. Why we're always coming back to, we're always agog at Cracked Magazine breaking through every once in a while with better coverage than anybody else in the market.
Well, that's the whole problem. The media, and this happened.
Well, you're breaking up quite a bit.
Okay.
All right. Well, our audio, our connection's not that good. Can you hear us?
All right, so maybe I should leave it then. But if you can hear me,
yes,
Russia, the juxtaposition of Spy for Me versus Uncovering versus Beltway media, mainstream media, is
well, we got your introductory note, but not the payoff. Okay, I can imagine you're driving around town, and so maintaining a good connection is going to be quite a challenge. If you find yourself permanently planted somewhere anytime soon, you can certainly join us again and try and get that across. Let's round up the comments of the last couple minutes and add a few more of our pieces that we've been holding on to. Let's see, we got Mitchell Hirsch, whose handle on Twitter seems to be is it Bochard? But you can find him at the address at Mitchell Hirsch. Just asking regarding Ben Sass's simple repeal plan. That's where we are on the healthcare front this morning, and we probably should at least give some acknowledgement to that. The latest thinking is to come back to the floor, I guess, once again after the July 4th recess. We've successfully pushed things off until after the July 4th recess, at least. To come back with, well, let's just take care of repealing Obamacare, and then we can come up with a better solution for replacing it later. And everybody, I think, has correctly pointed out that that's where things started some months ago, and it was pretty quickly concluded that, America couldn't stand for that, and that it was very unlikely to work procedurally and politically, particularly in the Senate, because nobody believed that the Republicans would ever get around to the replace part. They couldn't repeal this thing without some sort of immediate replacement. That was their initial conclusion because, nobody had any confidence in their ability to come up with a replacement. And obviously we see why. Given, 8 years to come up with some ideas about replacements, they never did. And then when it finally fell to them to replace Obamacare because they could actually possibly repeal or otherwise destroy it, they still didn't come up with anything. They basically came up with a couple of ways to tinker with things, but also strip out money and hand it away as tax cuts. They really still have not come up with anything. And so the idea of, well, let's just go ahead with the repeal and come back to the replace later, that's just a thin disguise for we're just not going to get around to it. I mean, the ultimate result of this would be, and I think everyone recognizes it, repealing whatever parts of it they can actually repeal and then just saying, gosh, I don't know what to replace it with, and never getting around to it. So that came up, and regarding this idea, though, Mitchell asks, would it need 60 votes in the Senate? In other words, could reconciliation be used to do the repeal part? And it's a very broad question. I don't know if I can answer it offhand because, well, for one thing, we don't know what repeal actually means, and neither did they. It's not a one-liner. I mean, you could try to go with the old, the Affordable Care Act. However, it's codified in the code of, in the United States Code. You could simply say that it's repealed, and that has a certain effect. But and this has been discussed before, and it's awfully complex, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I know this, that the original design of the Affordable Care Act is such that many sections of the existing U.S. Code, innumerable sections of the then existing U.S. Code were modified. And though repealing the Affordable Care Act would invalidate all the language that they used to touch these different parts of the code, and you could certainly parse things out and find which sections of the code were changed and undo those changes. There's also changes being made to all kinds of non-discretionary spending formulas, and that requires an additional hour or two to explain the difference between discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending. But there's basically things that changes that were made to formulas that are themselves not dependent necessarily on any independently existing statutory language. There's nothing to erase, in other words, or to rewrite or undo in any way that can simply erase all traces of the Affordable Care Act. It's a very complex thing. So the idea of simply going back in time and not passing the Affordable Care Act, basically, there's no effective way of doing that. Simply by saying that the Affordable Care Act is hereby repealed. You'd have to kind of go at these individual pieces one at a time, and you could certainly package it all up in one legislative vehicle, but it would be a pretty complex one, and that's where the trouble arises. Can they bring it under reconciliation rules? In general, I would say that it's possible that a large portion of it could be done under reconciliation, in that it would comply with the still current reconciliation requirements outlined in the budget resolution. It would almost certainly fall under the jurisdiction of the Senate Finance Committee, and almost certainly fall under the jurisdiction of the Senate Help Committee as well, though it might involve some other ones. This is where it really just the first level at which it really becomes complex. There would almost certainly be other issues involved that would require the work of other committees as well, and that would raise jurisdictional issues and points of order against parts of the bill as regards its eligibility for reconciliation procedures. But certainly on the surface, I would say that the work required of the Help Committee and of the Finance Committee for repeal only, one, would cover the bulk of what was happening, and two, would almost certainly achieve the minimum savings required by the budget resolution as well. It would probably exceed the minimum savings by a factor of 100 or more, because if you're just repealing everything, although it would also reduce revenues to some extent by repealing the taxes. But to this point, they've managed to get that past reconciliation rules as well. So my guess is that they could absolutely use reconciliation to partially repeal the Affordable Care Act, and they may be able to repeal enough of it that the remaining pieces of it are crippled or, critically injured, certainly, in ways that would lead to their inevitable collapse. But in order to just do a root and branch repeal, as they like to say, whatever that's supposed to mean, I imagine that's their concept of the most complete repeal, the thing that the concept that most closely resembles what they wished could happen simply by saying the act is hereby repealed. So a lot of it probably could be done by reconciliation, although depending on what set of rules they're going to adhere to with respect to the availability of reconciliation, for whatever reason, to this point, and I think it was just mainly an excuse, they have been clinging to an interpretation of reconciliation that limits them in time in some respects. In other words, that they would have to pass a reconciliation bill. Let's say some interpretations of it are that they would have to pass the reconciliation bill before the end of the fiscal year. I've always been doubtful about the expiration of reconciliation rules. And, I've never really come up with anything that satisfactorily explains to me why a set of reconciliation instructions that hadn't been used yet would expire, or even if they had been used. My thinking has always been, that's been the traditional interpretation of things, but my thinking has always been, if you issue reconciliation instructions that says the Help Committee and the Finance Committee, just to use the same examples, each have to report out legislation saving $1 billion apiece. And you do that. And the Help Committee and the Finance Committee both report out legislation saving $2 billion apiece. And therefore it qualifies. And you use reconciliation to pass it. Lots of people will tell you, you can only have one shot at it a year. You can only use reconciliation once a year or once per instruction anyway. And I don't really know why anybody interprets it that way. That's often the way it's happened. But I know that there have been examples where there's been more than one reconciliation bill in a year. And it's not because the budget resolution says there should be more than one or can be more than one, or that, or even names a number and says that there shall be two. It's just, if you think about the instructions, all I'm requiring for the use of the expedited reconciliation procedure here is that you use these committees and that they save this much money. And if you use the same committees again and they save even more money, I don't see any particular problem with that. I don't see how that violates reconciliation instructions. It just does more of it. So I don't know. I think I think it arises from a misunderstanding of the use of reconciliation. I think it sometimes gets described in shorthand in the media as, it unfortunately ends up getting described in sort of magical terms, that it's and they say, I think wrongly and for no particular reason, that it's the once a year shot at passing something without having to worry about the filibuster, as if Robert Byrd and the other framers of the Budget Act, it had nothing to do with budgets. They just recognized that filibusters were annoying things, and they're so annoying, and the whole Senate knew it, that one day they sat down and said, well, there ought to be a law that says that once a year you get to pass whatever you want without having to worry about the filibuster. That's what we should do. And then it's like kids came up with the framing of reconciliation. It's the reason for it is because the filibuster is so annoying, and we can't get rid of the filibuster. But we should have here's it once a year on July 4th. Anything you wish for can be legislated without it's not that kind of magic bullet. It has a purpose, and fulfilling the purpose is what gives you protection from the filibuster. They adjudged it a good thing, and in hindsight, maybe they should not have done this, but this was all the rage at the time. Budget cutting, all the rage, and we got to keep our deficits in line and our fiscal house in order. And we've learned since from modern monetary theorists and others that this stuff doesn't really often matter at all, and it's just a political ploy. And it makes a great parallel to Armando's theories about the Supreme Court, or indeed any court, that they are in fact political bodies, and but particularly at the Supreme Court, it's part of the mandate that you decide what you want the outcome to be from a social perspective, and then you find ways to use laws and precedents to justify the conclusion you've come to. And every once in a while, you'll run into the sort of case that's just like, logically it's just not consistent. What I want is just not consistent with what we've ruled in the past, and I lose. Or, if you're really stubborn about it, you invent a new test, and although you get outvoted, you write a scathing dissent and propose this new test and leave it out there for the next time a crazy conservative idiot might think that it makes sense, and see if you can revive it. It might take 100 years, but you can do it. If you're determined. Anyway, it's a sort of a good parallel to this the idea that deficits don't matter. When you need to bash liberal programs, you scream about the deficit. When you need to cut taxes, you forget about the deficit, and you say things like, nobody cares about the deficit. The deficit doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out it doesn't. It's just that it never did. Anyway, so when they framed reconciliation in the Budget Act, the thinking was that budget cutting was always a good thing, and that it was difficult to do because there's all sorts of, well, as they would like to put it, special interests out there always looking to protect their turf, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was very difficult at any given time to find 60 votes that would get together and invoke cloture on a bill that would target, it finally landed on some particular spending target. That there would almost always be, and in 1974 and through the 80s it was largely true, there would always be a coalition you could put together of 41 votes for almost any government program, which of course is not that surprising. The people who build those programs are right there in the Senate, and they appreciate those things. And it took a generation of campaigning to elect Republican nihilists to get it to the point where it would, in fact, become difficult to put together a coalition of 60 in favor of, obliterating some significant chunks of federal spending at any given time. Anyway, so when they built the reconciliation thing, the idea was if you can save money for the federal government and you can reduce the deficit, we'll give you a special pass. You still have to get a majority to vote with you, but you won't have to deal with the filibuster. But we're going to limit the opportunities to do it, not to once a year per se, but effectively to something like once a year, though that's not necessarily the upper limit of it. But you've got to plan in advance, and you've got to give everybody notice that you're planning to do this later on by putting in the budget resolution what kind of savings you want to achieve, how you anticipate achieving them, and which committees you're looking to do that work. And then all eyes will turn to those committees, and everyone will be on notice that certain types of spending are on the bubble. And then we have the fight in full view of everyone over whether or not, at long last, a majority of the Senate wants to preserve this spending or refuses to preserve this spending, and has come to the decision instead that it's time to trim the sails on this particular program. And it was, it tends to moderate itself in that respect. And it tends to it tends to be limited to once a year because it's a very intense fight. But there's literally nothing about the way it operates that I have ever seen that indicates that this is can only be done once. If the minimum goal is saving $1 billion, and this is the committee that's got to do it, if they report out one bill and comply with that imagined requirement, but their one bill saves $2 billion, nobody says, hey, wait a minute, the instructions were for $1 billion. No, it's $1 billion or more, just so long as it reaches the $1 billion threshold. Well, just so long as the bill and you can do a zero reconciliation bills. I mean, I guess there's that too. You call for a reconciliation bill that year under the budget resolution, but nobody takes up the challenge. There's nothing that says you have to have that bill. So if that's the case, then it's really not that hard to imagine that if you save $1 billion in bill number 1, and then the same committee that's right out in the open, everybody knows what it's doing. Everybody knows that it's got its eye on certain kinds of spending. It's holding hearings, which is not the case for this bill. I don't see any particular reason why you couldn't come back and do a second bill, so long as you. I guess you could say, well, if the second bill only saves $500 million, you could say, maybe that doesn't qualify because although you've already saved $1 billion, it's not cumulative. You can't hand me two bills that together add up to $1 billion. You couldn't do two $500 million ones, and you couldn't do $1 billion and $1.5 billion. You might have to do $1 billion each time you avail yourself of the reconciliation procedure. That I could see. But I can't see any limitations on the number of times you attempt reconciliation. And there would be a lot of historical anomalies to explain if that were the case. Sounds like my desktop tower's fan is whining like crazy. I hope that's not creating too much background noise here. I maybe should just shut it down. But it's so much easier to read everybody's comments on a second screen. Let's see. Other comments that have been made that require attention. Well, Rebecca Romans brings a very important story to the fore here, and we probably should not head into the weekend without picking up on this one. Chris Kobach, who is what title have they afforded him to play this particular game? You know, he's in charge of this sort of voting integrity commission of some kind that Trump put together. How can I even begin to explain what this is? Well, I'll bring up the Huffington Post story that I had put aside on this one. Sam Levine, writing for HuffPost these days. Rebecca has sent me what story here? The Think Progress version of this. So Kira Lerner's piece versus Sam Levine's. It's not a contest, guys. But I'll give you the background. You likely will know this already in autoplaying video because HuffPost. They got to do it. A committee that President Donald Trump convened to investigate voter fraud, and you'll recall that he's been out there claiming that 3 to 5 million illegal votes were cast and we got to do something about this. They weren't, and we don't, but that's Donald Trump for you. So he's convened this committee, and it's unclear to me exactly under what authority it operates, et cetera, and that will become an important question as we get up to date on what Kobach, who's the number one schemer for vote suppression in the country these days, is put in charge of this thing. A committee that President Donald Trump convened to investigate voter fraud, that doesn't exist, has begun asking election officials in certain states, and as I understand it, all states now, for registered voters' names and personal information. He's essentially requested on government letterhead. He's actually fishing on government letterhead, and again, it's letterhead of a commission that's brand new and has no particular grounding in history or tradition or, for all I know, law. That's just written to the secretaries of state of all 50 states, I thought, and asked them, please give us your entire voter rolls. I want everybody's name. I want all their full names, their middle names. I want the last 4 digits of their social security number where you have those. I want their voter registration where you keep those in those states. And I want their voting histories, and I want their addresses. And I mean, all kinds of the most sensitive possible information, by the way, which should be turned over to a guy who, one, has just been sanctioned by the court for misleading the court in his arguments about voter registration issues in general, and two, who has, even before he got a government job in the Trump administration, got himself in trouble with information security issues by being photographed meeting with the president with his super secret memo about deportation plans and voter suppression plans on full display by just holding it outside. He has a leather folder that would hide everything from view. He's got it outside, facing out in front of the cameras. Mr. InfoSec here. Anyway, the commission, which is formally charged, by whom, by what, I don't know, with investigating election integrity, or so it is claimed, let's say, sent a letter to election officials on Wednesday. Members asked officials to provide publicly available voter roll data, including the full first and last names of all registrants, everybody in the state, middle names or initials if available, addresses, dates of birth, political party if recorded in your state, last 4 digits of the social security number if available, voter history, that is, elections voted in from 2006 onward, active, inactive status, canceled status, information regarding any felony convictions, information regarding voter registration in another state, information regarding military status, and overseas citizen information. The letter also asks election officials a series of questions, including what changes they would make to enhance the integrity of federal elections and how the panel can support local officials to improve election security. The letter, which makes no specific reference to Russian hacking in the 2016 election, also asks states to provide instances of voter fraud and convictions of election-related crimes since 2000. In other words, I didn't expect them to bring up any reference to Russian hacking, but basically they say, tell us about any crimes, election-related crimes you know of since 2000. Well, the Russians hacked the election. Does that count? No. Voting advocates are closely watching the commission, which had its first conference call on Wednesday to work out logistics. because they say the group is laying the groundwork for a more restrictive voting laws. Notably, the commission is also making recommendations for preventing voter intimidation and disenfranchisement, something not specifically outlined in the executive order creating the commission. So there's your answer about its legal foundation. Vanita Gupta, the former head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division under President Barack Obama, said the letter made it clear the commission was pursuing voter suppression. Trump has claimed repeatedly, without evidence, that millions of people voted illegally in the 2016 election. Chris Kobach, Kansas Secretary of State and Vice Chairman of the committee, has a history of exaggerating voter fraud and pushing laws that make it more difficult to vote. And I mean, has a history is linked to that full history, according to the Huff Post. And we probably should review that at some point, like maybe next. Studies have shown that voter fraud is not a widespread problem. You all know that. And by the way, the second picture, or the picture illustrating the Think Progress piece, which I haven't yet been reading, is the picture of Kobach and Trump, with Kobach's got that secret memo that I mentioned in full view outside of his leather folder. The picture of Trump and Kobach together that illustrates the HuffPost piece has magically got all of the paper inside his leather binder. That would be on the way out of the meeting, I guess. And he figured out, oh yeah, I should, well, he probably didn't give any thought to, oh yeah, I should hide it. It's just the meeting was over and he threw everything back into the folder. But it's there by way of proof, in case you needed it, that you can, in fact, put your papers inside a leather folder if you have one. And that fantastic innovation discovered by Harvard graduate Chris Kobach during the course of that meeting. History was made. Jason Kander comes up in this piece. Jason Kander, the former Missouri Democratic Secretary of State, who now leads a voting advocacy group called Let America Vote, expressed concern about the panel seeking voters' personal information. It's obviously very concerning when the federal government is attempting to get the name, address, birth date, political party, and social security number of every voter in the country. I certainly don't trust the Trump administration with that information, and people across the country should be outraged, he said in a statement. And by the way, if a Democratic president were doing this, conservatives would be outraged. This, even though, I guess it might as well be pointed out, you would think the federal government already had a list of everybody's social security number. After all, we get them from you. So I think that's probably already out there. And I in the sense that you're revealing the social security number to the government, I guess it's not particularly worrying. Of course, the part of it that is worrying is, I think, more disturbing is voter history and voter registration. That's not necessarily something anybody would normally want to turn over to the federal government, but you do turn it over to the state government by virtue of their administering elections. And, of course, they're worried about the integrity of federal elections. It's not that the federal government doesn't have a claim on this information. It's just that maybe you want to test out, balance the equities a little bit on this one and see whether they really need to have all that information. And then that's before you even get to the fact that, well, this Trump administration is, in fact, kleptocratic thugocracy like the Russian oligarchy, and turning over information to the government isn't the same thing that it used to be. The government used to be an entity that, as frustrating as it was viewed by those comprising it not as a mechanism for personal profit or personal gain, not the case any longer. So, for instance, do you really want to hand over to the government that's packed at the top levels with people with the closest possible associations to data mining firms like Cambridge Analytica? Do you want to make it, legally obligatory on all 50 states that everybody who's registered to vote anywhere in America or in the American territories, I assume they're going to get to, I shouldn't give them any ideas. Maybe Chris Kobach rather, I mixed up the two secretaries of state there, the good one and the bad one. Maybe Chris Kobach forgets that there are voters registered in other territories, or maybe he just doesn't care about them, or maybe there's just no fraud in Guam. What do you think? Anyway, I wouldn't want to hand it over to anybody anyway, but I certainly wouldn't want to give somebody who's so loose with information security any of this stuff, and I certainly wouldn't want to do that with somebody who's also got good reason to want to get in the good graces of people who operate on the side, businesses in the for-profit sector whose profits depend on their ability to vacuum up the most specific voter information possible. If you could provide, if everything I got sent to me by the 50 states I had in my briefcase over here somehow ended up in the database of Cambridge Analytica, wouldn't that be really great for certain elements of this so-called government? Sure. Of course it would be. And come on, I mean, it's all publicly available, etc. I mean, actually, most of it probably Cambridge Analytica could get their hands on by pursuing this with all 50 states. But as you can see, even when the federal government ostensibly asks this question, not everybody is willing to comply. Who knows how much work is involved in doing that, and are you willing to spend your private sector dollars on a fruitless pursuit like this, that by the time you got even something close to 100% compliance with all that, the voter rolls would have changed in all those other states by then anyway, and you'd have to start all over again. Well, one solution is, couldn't we make the federal government pay for all that investigative work and then just, handed it to Cambridge Analytica? Well, there's nothing we can do about it. The data just wanted to be free. Information just wants to be free, man. I couldn't stop it. It freed itself. It landed in the pockets of the company I own, but what can I do about that? Of course it's going to land there. Anyway, the panel is requesting the states submit the data using a secure file exchange. Yeah, right. Still, David Becker, the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation, said there were significant privacy concerns. The committee is requesting very highly sensitive individual information that is not publicly available in pretty much every state. He told HuffPost, noting that the letter says any documentation states submit to the panel will be made public. So that would be problematic if that describes the issues correctly. Can you imagine basically making publicly available a list of all the members of our military who are registered to vote and giving people their addresses? He asked. It's entirely warranted that states, especially before they hand over individual level data over to anybody, ask, what do you need this data for? How are you going to use it? What's going to happen to the data while you hold it? Where is it going to be stored? What are the protections in place? And what are you going to do with it when you're done? It's unclear to what extent states will comply with the committee's request for voter information. Connecticut Secretary of State Denise Merrill said her office, she's a Democrat, by the way, would share data with the commission in the spirit of transparency, but that the commission would have to share its internal documents in that same spirit. We will request that the commission share any memos, meeting minutes, or additional information, as state officials have not been told precisely what the commission is looking for, she said in a statement. She's not going to get that. This lack of openness is all the more concerning considering that the vice chair of the commission, Chris Kobach, has a lengthy record of illegally disenfranchising eligible voters in Kansas. True. Vermont Secretary of State Jim Kondos, also a Democrat, told HuffPost that his office would only disclose the information required under the Freedom of Information Act. The panel requested that states provide information by July 14th, a deadline he said would be difficult for his 5-member team to meet. Yeah, I would think almost everybody would have difficulty with that one. And if you don't, create it. Kay Stimson, a spokesperson for the National Association of Secretaries of State, said other secretaries of state intend to treat the information like a Freedom of Information Act request, which would mean the kind of information released would vary by state. The panel intends to match voter data against, it says anyway, against a Department of Homeland Security database of undocumented people in the United States. The Washington Times reported on Wednesday, previous attempts to weed out illegal voting using the same DHS database have produced faulty results and led to incorrectly identifying eligible voters as non-citizens. Why, I have a report right here that there is a John Smith illegally in this country, and the only thing we can do is we got to throw out all the John Smiths until we can figure out what the hell's going on in this country. Is that a decent approach? That's the one they intend to take. Separately, on Wednesday, states received a letter from the Department of Justice requesting information on how they purge voters from their rolls in compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. There have been several lawsuits in recent years over illegal purges. Kondos said he didn't see anything unusual about the DOJ's letter, but that both letters arriving the same day was unusual. Sam Bagenstos, Bagenstos, former Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, what a title, in the Obama administration, said the DOJ letter clearly signaled the department was preparing to take action against states. He said this on Twitter, the tweet herein embedded. The committee's first public meeting is scheduled for July 19th in Washington, D.C. So the deadline, the letter, by the way, is included in the piece here. You can take a look at it. Deadline for submitting all the states' data, July 14th, and they're going to digest it in 5 days and meet on the 19th. Although they could just meet and say, everybody have a donut. We got 29 states in. We got to get the rest. Let's see. The Think Progress piece on this that Rebecca recommended. Let's see if there's anything in particular that we can pull out of this. We'll skim quickly. Kira Lerner and Joshua Eaton on the Think Progress piece entitled Trump's Voter Fraud Commission is laying the groundwork for voter suppression. Let's see. We know it's Chris Kobach. That's no different here. Let's see. He asked all 50 secretaries of state, so that's confirmed, for all the publicly available voter roll data. The letter does not say how Kobach or Vice President Mike Pence, the commission chair, plan to use information or how they will keep it secure. By the way, the letterhead that they used, where is this? I'm just curious. They had to come up with, the commission's a new thing, so they had to kind of come up with a thing. And what it's got is it's the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, and the letterhead they came up with has that sort of across the top and superimposed on the seal of the President of the United States, which I guess is not totally inappropriate since it was created by executive order. But just interesting. Sort of they have to present themselves as official in some way, and just curious, design-wise, how they decided to imply that they had presidential authority to do this, and we're hoping that people would comply because the seal is on there. I guess that's legit if they're created by executive order. Of course, you could question whether the executive order is valid, but okay. Anyway, anything else here? Let's see. Instead of enlisting prominent Democratic election experts, Kobach and the commission found low-profile people like a West Virginia county clerk and a former Arkansas state legislator who told Think Progress he wasn't sure why he himself was chosen. That is for, I guess, inclusion on the committee, on the commission. I guess the question of how they comprised it. We understand why Kobach is on it. He was named to it by the president. And we understand why Pence is on it. He, too, placed there by the president. In the May executive order forming the commission, I guess, Trump said the commission would be bipartisan and would look into both voter fraud and suppression, but major voting groups, including the American Civil Liberties Union, urged Democrats not to participate in a body they claim will turn into a witch hunt for fraud with the goal of passing more suppressive voting laws. So that's where this comes in. Instead of enlisting prominent Democratic election experts, Kobach found these low-profile people who have no idea why they were asked to join this thing. But in the meantime, it's him, the most prominent vote suppressor in the country for Republicans, and the vice president. And then everybody, I guess, it's going to be bipartisan, but we're going to invite people who don't know anything and who are going to be intimidated by our power into just sitting there and being quiet, I guess. Other Democratic Commission members, including Maine Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, how about that, and New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner, said they hoped the group would also examine Russia's interference in the 2016 election. The letter makes no mention of those plans. That'll be a tough sell there. And I'm not suggesting that those two guys would sit meekly for all of this necessarily, but I don't know how comfortable they're going to be or how powerful they're going to be in terms of redirecting this commission's focus. I don't know that they have any power. We don't know what the internal operating rules of this group are going to be, and I'm sure they're going to make them up as they go along, and there'll be probably a couple of lawsuits about that as well. All right. Let's instead turn to, I just want to take a brief look at the linked article in the HuffPost piece that we read earlier that referenced Kobach's history. The guy helping lead Trump's voter fraud probe likes to exaggerate voter fraud, is the headline on Sam Levine's piece of May 12th of this year. Chris Kobach repeatedly stokes fears that the wrong people, more auto-playing video, thank you, HuffPost, repeatedly stokes fears that the wrong people are casting ballots. How so? Shortly after he became Kansas Secretary of State in 2011, Chris Kobach wrote a Wall Street Journal commentary asserting that voter fraud was prevalent in his state and across the country. Kansas had just passed one of the toughest voting laws in the country, requiring residents to show a photo ID at the polls and prove their citizenship when they registered to vote. He wrote that his office had already identified 67 non-citizens registered to vote. Get them. Now, if that was guns, by the way, that would be statistically insignificant, but okay. And he estimated that it would likely identify hundreds more. To underscore his claim about rampant fraud, he alleged that 50 Somali citizens had voted for a state representative in the 2010 Kansas City, Missouri race, in which the margin of victory was just one vote. But Kobach left out that a Missouri court had already looked at the claims of voter fraud in that election and found that they were not credible. The credible evidence proves that there was no voter misconduct and there was no voter fraud with regard to this election. Judge Stephen Nixon of the Missouri Court of Appeals wrote, and you know it's true because it's the Nixon. What? Okay. No relation. This incident constitutes just one of a number of times in which Kobach has greatly exaggerated the occurrence of fraud in an attempt to justify making it harder for people to vote. This is absolutely his MO. And I've seen I've seen hundreds of reports of these stories. It's the same couple of stories over and over again, but they're quite alarming. Anyway, now he's been tapped as the vice chair of this new advisory commission, and activists worry that he will use this position to stoke fears that voter fraud is widespread, even though it's virtually non-existent, and to lay the groundwork for voting restrictions. Kobach's appointment is a clear signal that this effort is no more than a voter fraud witch hunt like the one that took place in my home state at the behest of now Texas Governor Greg Abbott, said Representative Mark Vesey, Democrat of Texas, co-chair of the House Voting Rights Caucus, in his statement on, back then in earlier May. During Secretary Kobach's term, the state of Kansas implemented a severely restrictive new voter ID law designed to discourage and suppress votes rather than assure fair elections. We all have reason to be wary of his intentions leading this commission. The Brennan Center for Justice described Kobach as having little credibility as an impartial investigator of election integrity. He's a known promoter of efforts to restrict voting and one of the nation's primary peddlers of the myth of voter fraud. On February 12th, the White House pointed the media to Kobach as someone who could provide evidence of voter fraud, but in multiple televised interviews, he struggled to actually do that. Mr. Harvard did. Kobach appeared on CNN the next day and was asked about the promised evidence, but he said he was still collecting the data. He noted at the time he had filed 9 cases against people suspected of double voting and obtained 6 guilty pleas. 6 cases does not rampant widespread voter fraud make, CNN anchor Kate Bulden replied. Kobach didn't fare much better in an interview with Fox Business's Neil Cavuto. He initially said that an expert had told him that as many as 18,000 non-citizens could be on the voter rolls in Kansas, but eventually he was forced to concede that only a fraction of that number might be voting. Although his office was granted the power to prosecute voter fraud nearly 2 years ago, Kobach only recently announced that he'd obtained his first guilty plea in a case of a non-citizen voting. Last year, Kobach fought to uphold Kansas's proof of citizenship requirement in federal court, arguing that 25 incidents of non-citizens attempting or actually registering to vote in one county was just, quote, the tip of the iceberg. But the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit upheld a temporary injunction against the requirement, finding Kobach's argument that there could be thousands of non-citizens on the voting rolls to be pure speculation. Earlier this year, U.S. District Judge Julie Robinson, who was appointed to the federal bench by President George W. Bush, wrote that the burden imposed by Kansas's proof of citizenship law cannot be justified by the scant evidence of non-citizen voter fraud that occurred in Kansas before the law was passed. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit also highlighted the very small numbers in a separate voting rights case last year, noting that in Arizona and Kansas, only a tiny fraction of 1% of registered voters were non-citizens. In Kansas, over 20,000 voters who did not provide proof of citizenship when they registered to vote were placed on a suspense list. Suspense? Okay. And could have been removed from the voter rolls if they failed to provide adequate documentation within 90 days. A February report by the Kansas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said the law may have been written and implemented with improper discriminatory intent, as we found out was the case, of course, way back when in North Carolina, when they had their laws invalidated. Speaking of which, I'm going to jump back out of this. Somewhere in pocket, I'm pretty sure I have got another couple of pieces of evidence of Kobach's stretching the truth when it comes to just individual stories of people who had been denied their right to vote. And you know what? I don't even see it handy right now. I might not have marked it. You've likely seen things like this already, as I have. Yesterday, a lot of discussion of a 91-year-old World War II veteran who registered to vote for the first time in Kansas back before they, asked for any, certainly never asked for any establishment of your citizenship. It was presumed, and of course, he's been a U.S. citizen all his life and fought in World War II and everything. And when he was the lead plaintiff in one of these cases, Kobach is actually standing there in court and saying, well, sure, he fought in World War II, but that doesn't by itself prove that he's a citizen, and it doesn't, but it doesn't prove that he's not, for one thing, obviously. And I mean, why isn't the assumption that somebody born in the United States and who's lived here all his life a citizen? Because they are. If you're born here, that's it. But apparently that's not enough. You didn't offer up any. The law says you have to offer proof, and all you did was say you were born here. Well, I proved that I was born here. Well, but you didn't prove that makes you a citizen. Well, that's in the Constitution. Well, you didn't raise that. I don't know. I mean, he's just everything he does, and he's found himself sanctioned by the court for being so obviously disingenuous and all these things. So, of course, obviously he's the natural choice for Trump's commission. Okay. Anyway, you've likely seen stories like that too. I'll try and dig one up and find that reference just so we can prove, or we can get the story straight. Anyway, I have to offer my proof that I really read that at some point. Let's see. Other things that need to be brought up and discussed. Gosh, there's so much today. Let's try this one here. I mentioned North Carolina. Let's throw this one in there just for another regional piece here. North Carolina has been going insane lately, and of course, because they had such a close election, you'll remember that there was an attempt by the previous Republican governor to think even about trying to engineer some sort of exercise some constitutional powers to somehow keep himself in office, though he had lost the election. And then when he gave up on that, he was busying himself looking for ways to just undermine the new governor's ability to get anything done and ability to roll back crazy-ass changes that he had made in election laws and in the composition of the courts, etc. North Carolina, though, back in the news. The Charlotte Observer has this interesting editorial today, and I thought I would share this one with you. In North Carolina, what a political witch hunt really looks like, referring to, I'm sure, Donald Trump's complaints. This by the entire Editorial Observer board, unsigned beyond that. On Wednesday afternoon, in the midst of a breathless display of legislative pettiness in Raleigh, Representative Becky Carney of Mecklenburg County tried to get her head around what was happening in front of her. At a North Carolina House Committee meeting, a Republican lawmaker wanted to take the first step toward impeaching, guess who? Secretary of State Elaine Marshall, who happens to be a Democrat, of course. This despite having no state legal opinion or law enforcement agencies saying Marshall had even done anything wrong. What a fun time to be impeaching a Democratic Secretary of State. I wonder what they're doing about complying with Chris Kobach's request. It's not in here. It's not related, or not obviously related anyway. I don't know whether to laugh or cry, Carney said. We have another suggestion. North Carolinians, regardless of their political persuasion, should be outraged at the depths to which political acrimony has sunk in their state legislature. It's poisonous and dangerous. And maybe you could call out one particular party for it. No, too dangerous. It's poisonous and it's dangerous, and it's not limited to an action against the Secretary of State. But this attack is especially contemptible.
It's one that began back in February when Republican Representative Chris Millis of Pender County launched an investigation into whether Marshall was allowing undocumented immigrants, at the heart of things again, undocumented immigrants to be notaries public. Interesting. Not on my radar yet, right? Millis said Marshall's office has licensed more than 300 non-citizens as notaries. And I guess that's designed to get the Trumpies to say, what? How dare you? But, just stop for a second. So what, right? I mean, you've licensed more than 300 non-citizens as notaries. Notaries don't have to be citizens. They don't. And really, who cares about who's a notary public at this point? I mean, you're supposed to be able to trust their integrity of notaries public, and they're technically, for that reason, they're important in doing all sorts of legal business. But I mean, since when has the citizenship status of notaries public ever been an issue? But he found this. Okay. So it goes further, though. 300 non-citizens are notaries public, but at least 250 of those are in the federal DACA program, which allows people brought illegally to the United States as children to remain in the country. It is a rather remarkable thing that so many people covered by DACA would end up as notaries public, and particularly that such a large percentage of the non-citizens in total who are notaries public. But I guess one might ask, how many notaries public are there in North Carolina at all? That number never comes up, and probably with good reason. It would render the 300 or the 250 of the 300 a nullity. But okay. In the meantime, there's one, so everybody's angry. State and federal laws don't require notaries to be U.S. citizens, but they are required to, quote, reside legally in the United States. And I guess there would be some question about, for those who question the validity of the DACA program, of course, and there are, that's a certain kind of person, certainly, anti-immigrant, and virulently anti-immigrant, and it's coming under wider and wider attack now that that's been legitimized by our accidentally having legitimized Donald Trump in general. But anyway, I mean, that's a good question. If you are covered by DACA, or do you legally reside in the United States? At present, yes. But if you delegitimize DACA, then I guess later, no. And finally, all those lucrative notary public jobs open up to native-born North Carolinians. I mean, what's at stake here? And the answer is, the whole reason this is such an outrage is it's just a way to create a scandal and use it to impeach a statewide elected Democrat, and that's all they're after. Marshall, in a statement, said that every non-citizen has presented appropriate federally issued work authorization documentation, and that her office has openly communicated with the General Assembly about our process. If Republicans thought otherwise, they could raise the issue with state attorneys or law enforcement. Millis, it appears, hasn't had any success doing things the right way. When asked by Representative Nelson Dollar of Wake County if any state or federal law enforcement agency had decided to investigate or bring charges against Marshall, Millis said only that he did a legislative request. So the answer to the question is no. Dollar shot back, according to WRAL.com. Dollar, as it happens, is a Republican. Appropriately. I mean, if you didn't guess that, his name's Dollar. But okay. Yet even he decided to join his party members in the end on the committee in voting for a resolution calling for an impeachment investigation. Wow. So just like all the people, I can't go along with this health care plan, or I find Donald Trump's comments about Mika Brzezinski beyond the pale and unacceptable, but here's $1,000 for your reelection committee and I endorse you. It's happening here on the state level, too. If the full House approves, a committee of 9 Republicans and 6 Democrats will decide if there's enough evidence to warrant proceedings, guess how they'll decide, that would remove Marshall from office. It is, sadly, only the latest example of how Republicans have moved from mere political vitriol, from the usual sniping across the aisle, to very real attacks on people's livelihoods and careers. Just this legislative session, Republicans have gutted the office of Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein, with nonsensical budget cuts that will likely result in the firings of more than 100 attorneys and staffers. In that same budget, Republicans also surgically removed the position of 3 staffers in the Department of Public Instruction who happened to be campaign volunteers for former State Superintendent June Atkinson, a Democrat. And now this, a significant step toward impeachment proceedings without waiting for legal or law enforcement support. Don't laugh, North Carolina. Don't cry. Be ashamed of what your state legislature has become. And I guess a good warning to those of you listening in North Carolina. I hope we opened your eyes to something, or more, I guess, to the point, I hope you already knew that and you're just happy that we're opening the eyes of the rest of the country to this. But it can sometimes be difficult to track what's going on, even though it's happening in your own backyard. Not the most transparent institution, state legislatures. Not your fault, but just another, I don't know what, another brick in the wall, if you will, on that. Okay, let's see. Other things, I guess before we leave for the weekend, maybe we'll share this one. A New York Magazine piece from Jonathan Chait, which some of you may have seen. But just to help organize your thoughts over the weekend, because I have a feeling it's going to be kind of a wild weekend in terms of fallout from this Wall Street Journal piece. But Jonathan Chait warns us, and I think we're probably with him on this. Stop assuming Trump is innocent of Russian collusion. I don't think any of us have been particularly aggressive in assuming his innocence here, but the opinion makers of the world have been, and that's why this is part of the reason why I was saying up at the beginning of the show, why I was even having difficulty formulating my sentences about the Wall Street Journal's piece being the first evidence here. It's not. It's just, it's being sold as the first evidence by opinion makers who to this point have refused to believe that there really is any evidence, because they say, well, if there is, it's just circumstantial evidence. Well, the second word in circumstantial evidence is evidence, dude. There's evidence. It's not the strongest in the world, but don't say there's none. Chait puts it this way. One of the oddities of the investigation into Donald Trump's relations with Russia is the degree to which he has largely enjoyed a presumption of innocence. We like to do that in this country, we should say, in the court of public opinion, where we don't have to make that presumption, but we like to try anyway. David Brooks, that guy, who has hardly taken a sympathetic line on the administration, though he certainly could have gotten away with it, wrote recently, "It is striking how little evidence there is that any underlying crime occurred, that there was any actual collusion between the Donald Trump campaign and the Russians." This, by the way, brings back memories of the article we read about the manipulation of Google searches, about the question of whether there is any evidence of such collusion, and that there's been a huge data manipulation campaign on to make it look to someone doing a Google search on the question that there literally is none, even though all they have is the comments of people who are politically motivated saying there isn't. That's not the actual answer. This is just a lot of people have said this thing, which is not true. And it works on David Brooks, on both counts here. One, well, there's no crime involved here, and there doesn't have to be a crime involved. There is a crime involved here, but there doesn't have to be in order for it to be a serious issue. But there is one, and it's not the case that there's no evidence. There's plenty. It's just you don't find it very convincing yet. Okay. And he may even concede that, but it's still dangerous that you have to plow through that every time. Mike Allen, also winning the morning, observed, if Trump had kept Comey and stopped obsessing about his investigation, his legal troubles might have blown over. No evidence of collusion has emerged. That line of defense is likely to disappear now that the Wall Street Journal has reported that Peter Smith, a Republican opposition researcher who said he was working for Michael Flynn, colluded with Russian hackers to try to obtain stolen emails from Hillary Clinton. The Journal reports that Smith referred to conversations with Flynn in emails with associates, and that U.S. intelligence has evidence of Russian hackers discussing how to obtain emails from Mrs. Clinton's servers and then transmit them to Mr. Flynn via an intermediary. The Trump defense does not inspire a lot of confidence. That defense, a Trump campaign official said that Mr. Smith didn't work for the campaign. reports the Journal, and that if Mr. Flynn coordinated with him in any way, it would have been in his capacity as a private individual. Obtaining hacked information from Russia for the campaign as a campaign staffer versus doing it as a private individual is a distinction without much difference. Of course, the notion that there was no evidence of collusion before the Journal report has always been based on a tight definition of what constitutes evidence. It requires assuming that Trump's on-camera request for Russia to hack Clinton's emails during the campaign was a joke, and that his confidant Roger Stone obtained advanced knowledge of the timing of the WikiLeaks publication without any contact from Russia. This is all also not the first evidence of collusion between Russia and other Republican officials in the 2016 campaign. A relatively little-noticed Journal report from May found that Aaron Nevins, a Florida Republican operative, sought and received stolen Democratic voter turnout files from Guccifer 2.0. Remember him? A hacker believed by United States intelligence to be working for Russia. What's new is that explicit evidence of collusion may now extend to the Trump campaign itself. To be sure, the collusion story could still peter out, no pun intended, but Trump collected an inner circle of people whose most striking characteristic was anomalously close relations with Moscow. Before taking a job as Trump's campaign director, Paul Manafort was paid, we now know, $17 million, by the way, by a Ukrainian party controlled by Moscow to run a pro-Russian political influence campaign. By the way, somebody very deftly, I think, pointing out the other day how many times it turns out Paul Manafort got secret multi-million dollar payments from all sources connected to Russia, but worked for Donald Trump for free, quote unquote, for free. So how can you question the motives of someone who worked for somebody else for free? It was obviously for the good of the country. He thought it was the only thing, the only acceptable option, right? Well, but at the same time, all of a sudden, a bunch of Russians who have nothing to do whatsoever with Donald Trump decided to pay him millions and millions of dollars. So now he could afford to work, quote unquote, for free. Anyway, Manafort got all that money. Foreign policy advisor Carter Page has worked with Russian oil firms, fervently defended Russian policy interests in a way very few Americans have, and was, of course, targeted for recruitment by Russian spies. Plus, of course, Flynn, the spy already, for whom Smith allegedly sought the hacked emails, was paid $68,000, cheap by Manafort's standards, by Russian entities that he illegally failed to disclose. Whoops. Just happened to forget to disclose those guys. Trump himself has refused to disclose his tax returns, of course, but his son once boasted, Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets, and Trump has worked closely with Russian gangsters. Timothy O'Brien reported last week on Trump's shady Russian mob-linked business associates. That, of course, the Bayrock guys. We've been on top of that for a long time. The other oddity is how little effort Trump has made to dispel the impression that he sees Russia as a partner. After the Senate passed a bill to cement in place sanctions against Russia by a 97-2 vote, Trump lobbied the House to stymie or weaken the measure. Julian Borger in The Guardian reports today that Trump has told White House aides, that would have been yesterday, to come up with possible concessions. Please give me a list of concessions to offer as bargaining chips in his planned meeting next week with Vladimir Putin. An extraordinarily bad idea, according to two former officials familiar with the preparations. That's the preparations. Give me places and ways to cave to Putin. That's not what the president ought to be occupying himself with. That is odd, he concludes, isn't it? Trump normally relies on aggressive negotiation and unrequited demands and holds special disdain for giving anything of value without winning something in return. If the Guardian report is true, it is odd that he would break from this practice with Russia. Unless he believed, of course, Russia had some other leverage. I wonder what motivates the great deal maker, the great negotiator, to go into negotiations with Vladimir Putin with, please prepare a list of things I can give away to Putin so that I can make the man happy. I wonder why he would be motivated to do that. All right. Almost time to give up the microphone to the guys in the after show who will no doubt collect all the greatest hits of the day that we have missed. Anything else we need to kind of cram in there? I will say this. I put aside, and I really need to read for myself. Maybe you want to read it too. NBC News report of the other day. I'll give you the headline, and I'm once again moved to panic over this, although I've done nothing about it. Bill would bar Pentagon from business with Russian cyber firm Kaspersky. They're making a good point here. Once again, I mean, I have Kaspersky Internet Security on my computers, and apparently they're an approved vendor for the entire federal government, and of course the Pentagon as part of that as well. And up until recently, I guess I just thought it would be outrageous to believe that just because the guys who, engineered the thing were Russian, they're interested in making a good product. But they bring up a good point. Can we trust this anymore? And wouldn't it be a fantastical idea for Russian cyber warfare in general, if they said, what about if long term we launched a program? What if we had a Russian company compete on the open American market using their rules to become one of the top available products for Internet security? I mean, we should offer up a legit product and that really works so that it catches on in the marketplace. But what if it was programmed, with one of those secret back doors that only we knew about? And if we could get it to the point where it was an accepted product on the market, everybody was using it, and everyone was comfortable with it, you would eventually see it available for purchase by federal government entities. And let's just let that happen for a long time and do nothing until it gets in place at the Department of Defense one day, and then say, oh yeah, by the way, secret back door, let's open it up and read everything that's going on in the Pentagon. And it would help a lot, by the way, if the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency had a internet connection unsecured in his office. Then we could really exploit this stuff. Wouldn't that be amazing? But how could that possibly come together? That would never happen, right? I'm not sure exactly what they're alleging is happening here, but I wanted to bring this headline to your attention. And I guess, once again, I'm going to bring this up and say, I'm going to have to, decide what to do with my Kaspersky. I mean, it's time to renew my Kaspersky, too. Do I do it? Am I stupid? Am I imagining things? I mean, and you know what's funny is part of the reason that I have Kaspersky is I've tried in the past all these other products, and I've had McAfee and stuff, and I always just found Norton. All of them, they're all annoying, and they're just nonsensical, and I can't make them work right. It's hard to renew them even. And then it turns out that McAfee himself is a wacko, lunatic, libertarian bro, and who knows what to do. I don't know what to do. What are you doing? You can tell me, tweet me and tell me what you use for internet security and whether it's crazy to suspect. And really, I mean, what do I have that they're going to steal from me? But I don't know. I mean, at some point, you got to either take this stuff seriously or don't, right? Okay. Well, speaking of taking stuff seriously, let's hand things over to the guys on the after show to round up on all the stories that I didn't get to today. How about this one? In a surprising rebuke to Trump, the GOP-led House Appropriations Committee passed Representative Barbara Lee's 14-year-long effort to repeal the authorization for the use of military force. That was a big deal. I wonder whether that survived. I mean, the administration will lobby to get that killed in conference at some point. But it was exciting to see. They don't trust him with the keys to the military operation. Maybe that's it. There's much more, of course, and I'll have to try and squeeze more of that in after this brief announcement telling you what you've just been listening to for the last 2 hours. Someone's got to do it, right?
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Trump and Bannon threaten a global trade war as horrified cabinet officials beg them to stop, and NATO forces are ready to stop Russia in Eastern Europe. Oh boy, okay. For the last half, they'll be talking about a bunch of other stuff. Reports of nasty side effects from cosmetics are way up, and one hair company is to blame. All that and more next on The After Show.